On the night of February 26, 1930, a Bronx crime boss named Gaetano Reynina left a card game and was shot dead on a sidewalk with a shotgun blast to the head. His own boss had ordered it. That single killing set off a war that would run 14 months, claim the lives of two men who each called himself boss of all bosses, and end with a governing structure whose name still describes organized crime in New York today: the Five Families. New York City in 1930 was deep into prohibition, and bootlegging had made the Italian-American underworld more valuable than at any point in its history. That underworld was not one organization, but a patchwork of factions, most of them still organized around the villages and provinces their members had left behind in Sicily and southern Italy. The largest of these factions answered to Giuseppe Masseria, known on the street as Joe the Boss. Masseria had built the biggest bootlegging and racketeering operation in the city through the 1920s, and by 1930, he considered himself the dominant figure in New York's underworld, collecting tribute from smaller crews and absorbing rivals who did not fall in line. One faction resisted him, a cluster of crews built around immigrants from a single Sicilian fishing town, Castellammarese del Golfo, led by a relative newcomer to New York named Salvatore Maranzano. Masseria wanted the Castellammarese clan's Brooklyn rackets. Maranzano's people considered their independence non-negotiable. Reina's murder was the moment that turned a standoff into open war. Giuseppe Masseria had come to the United States from Sicily as a young man in the early 1900s and worked his way up through extortion, bootlegging, and the elimination of rivals until, by the late 1920s, he ran what was widely regarded as the single largest Italian-American crime faction in New York. He had already fought and won one boss war in the 1920s, absorbing the remnants of a rival organization after its own leadership was killed off, and he entered the conflict with Maranzano, assuming history would repeat itself. According to Selwyn Raab's Five Families, Masseria was ambitious, physically unimpressive by the standards of the men around him, and known even among his own soldiers for the number of assassination attempts he had personally survived. He was not a diplomat. He treated the smaller Sicilian and Calabrian crews scattered across the city as territory to be absorbed, rather than as allies to be negotiated with. And by 1930, that approach had made him the common enemy of several factions that otherwise had little in common with one another. Salvatore Maranzano presented a different kind of threat. He had arrived in the United States more recently than most of Masseria's rivals, in the early to mid-1920s, and unlike the typical crew boss of the era, he was educated. He had reportedly studied for the priesthood in Sicily before turning to crime, spoke Latin, and modeled his own ambitions openly on Julius Caesar and the structure of the Roman legions. Maranzano positioned himself as the defender of the Castellammarese clan and, more broadly, of the older Sicilian factions Masseria was trying to absorb, the traditionalists that younger, Americanized mobsters had already started calling, half-mockingly, the old Mustache Petes. Where Masseria ruled through force and appetite, Maranzano ruled through organization and long-term planning. Neither man was a stranger to violence. The difference was that Maranzano was patient enough to spend more than a year losing battles on the street while building the case, inside the underworld itself, that Masseria's rule had become intolerable. Both organizations operated on the same underlying code. Men were formally inducted as made men through a private ceremony binding them by oath to their borgata, and to the code of omertà, silence toward outsiders, absolute loyalty within the family, regardless of who happened to be leading it. That code was precisely what Masseria could not command from crews he had absorbed rather than earned, and precisely what allowed Luciano, once he had decided Masseria was finished, to shift his own loyalty without violating the code, as his own soldiers understood it. In his own reasoning, he was not betraying the borgata, only the boss who happened to be sitting on top of it. The war that followed Reina's murder was fought less like a single campaign than a series of ambushes and counter-ambushes across 3 boroughs. Reina's own crew, based in the Bronx and built around the ice distribution racket there, split after his death, with much of it eventually siding with Maranzano. The war reached into Masseria's own leadership circle before it ever reached him personally. On August 15, 1930, gunmen shot and killed Giuseppe Morello in his East Harlem office. Morello was not a minor figure. He had been one of the founding bosses of Italian-American organized crime in New York, going back to the 1890s. and by 1930, he served as Masseria's own consigliere, his chief advisor. His murder, documented both by historian Mike Dash's research into Morello's life and by Raab's broader history, demonstrated that the Castellammarese clan could strike inside Masseria's own command structure, not merely at the edges of it. Other Masseria loyalists were picked off through 1930 and into 1931, among them Stefano Ferrigno and Alfred Mineo, two of Masseria's senior captains, both killed within the same stretch of months as the two sides traded losses. By early 1931, the war had cost both factions soldiers, money, and, for Masseria specifically, the confidence of his own inner circle. That inner circle included a rising lieutenant named Charles Luciano, along with Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, younger men who, according to Raab, had grown frustrated watching two aging traditionalists burn through soldiers and money to settle what was, underneath the village loyalties and honor codes, mostly a fight over territory. Luciano concluded independently that Masseria could not win the war, and that continued loyalty to him was a losing bet, not a matter of principle. He opened a back channel to Maranzano's side and negotiated a private arrangement, peace for the Castellammarese clan, and a new position for himself, in exchange for delivering Masseria. On April 15, 1931, Masseria had dinner with several of his own men, including Luciano, at a restaurant called the Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island in Brooklyn. After the meal, the two men sat down to play cards. At some point, Luciano excused himself, reportedly to the restroom. Moments later, several gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Masseria to death at the table. According to Raab and other historian accounts, the men widely identified as the shooters were drawn from Luciano's own circle, working in concert with Maranzano's allies, though no one was ever formally charged. Masseria died at 54, the self-declared boss of all bosses, killed with the cooperation of the man closest to him. No federal case exists for either killing in this story, and that gap is itself part of the historical record. In 1931, organized crime as a national institution was not yet a federal law enforcement priority, and the racketeering statute federal prosecutors would eventually use to dismantle these families, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, was still nearly 4 decades away. J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau of Investigation would not seriously acknowledge the existence of a national Italian-American crime syndicate for more than 2 decades. The investigation into Masseria's death, like nearly every gangland killing of the era, belonged entirely to the New York City Police Department. It remains, on the books, an unsolved homicide. The documented record of what the Castellammarese War actually produced came later, and from an unexpected source. In 1963, a low-ranking former soldier named Joseph Valachi testified publicly before the United States Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, known as the McClellan Committee. Valachi was the first insider to describe, under oath and on the public record, the structure that emerged from this war, the division of New York's underworld into 5 governing families, and the ruling council that sat above them. His testimony did not cover the killings of Masseria or Maranzano in forensic detail. He had not been present for either, but it confirmed, for the first time to federal investigators and to the public, that the structure historians would later call the 5 families was real, that it dated to 1931, and that it had outlived every man who built it. Federal agents spent years afterward cross-referencing Valachi's account against surveillance records and older files, and much of what is now understood about 1931 comes from that later reconciliation. That same governing structure would become central again more than 2 decades after Valachi's testimony, when federal prosecutors used the RICO statute to charge the heads of the New York families as members of a single ongoing criminal enterprise in the 1985 Commission case, a prosecution that treated the ruling council born in this war as one organization more than 50 years old, not 5 separate ones acting independently. Selwyn Raab's 5 families and Anthony DeStefano's subsequent research both draw on Valachi's testimony, on FBI files released decades afterward under the Freedom of Information Act, and on court records from later prosecutions to reconstruct the sequence of events this episode has described. With Masseria dead, Maranzano moved quickly to claim the victory. According to Raab, he called a mass meeting of Italian-American crime figures from around the New York area Accounts of attendance range from several hundred to as many as 500 men, and used it to formally reorganize the city's underworld. He divided New York into 5 families, each with its own boss, each responsible for its own territory and its own soldiers. Vincent Mangano took one family, Thomas Gagliano took another, Joseph Profaci, who had led his own faction through the war on Maranzano's side, took a third. Charles Luciano, despite having delivered Masseria's death, was given command of a fourth. Maranzano kept the fifth for himself and placed himself above all 5 as boss of all bosses. At the same meeting, Maranzano formalized a chain of command that would outlast him by decades. Beneath each family boss, an underboss and a consigliere, and beneath them, capos, each commanding a crew of soldiers. It was, in effect, an organizational chart laid over what had previously been a looser set of personal loyalties, modeled openly on the Roman military structure Maranzano admired. He reportedly imposed a tax as well, collected from each family and paid to him personally as a condition of the peace. That tax, more than anything else, is what historians point to as the seed of the resentment that would end Maranzano's own reign within the year. The family bosses who had just finished fighting one absolute ruler over tribute and territory found themselves paying tribute to a new one within months of the peace. Those 5 organizations did not keep their 1931 names. Through later changes in leadership, Mangano's family became the family historians, and federal prosecutors would come to call the Gambino family. Gagliano's became the Lucchese family. Profaci's became the Colombo family. Luciano's own family eventually took the name of one of his successors, Vito Genovese, and the family Maranzano held onto for himself would later be known by the name of one of his own successors, Fortiforensebano. The same 5 organizations founded in this reorganization are the ones still referred to today, collectively, as the 5 families. The human cost of the 14 months leading to that meeting is harder to total than the political outcome. Historians place the number of underworld killings tied to the war at several dozen, spread across ambushes, retaliations, and the elimination of men on both sides whose loyalty was suspect. Most of the soldiers killed in that stretch are not named in the historical record at all, their deaths logged, if at all, as unsolved homicides in city precinct files, without the attention that followed the deaths of Reina, Morello, Ferrigno, Mineo, and eventually the 2 bosses themselves. Maranzano did not hold his new title long. According to Raab, within months of the meeting that made him boss of all bosses, he had concluded that Luciano and the younger men around him, Genovese and Costello among them, were a greater long-term threat to his authority than Masseria's old faction had ever been. Maranzano is reported to have drawn up a list for elimination and hired an outside gunman, Vincent Coll, to carry it out. The plan reached Luciano before it could be executed. On September 10, 1931, 4 men entered Maranzano's office in a Park Avenue building in Manhattan, identifying themselves as government agents there to examine his books. Once inside, they shot and stabbed Maranzano to death. The men were never identified with certainty, and no one was ever convicted, though historian accounts, drawing on later FBI files and cooperator statements, described the hit as arranged through Luciano's ally Meyer Lansky, using gunmen from outside the Italian-American underworld, specifically because Maranzano's own guards screened visitors by face and would not have recognized Italian shooters as a threat until it was too late, but had no reason to suspect men presenting government credentials. Maranzano was killed less than 5 months after declaring himself the supreme boss of New York's underworld. Luciano did not take the vacant title. According to Raab, he told the other family bosses that the position of boss of all bosses was itself the problem. A single seat worth killing for, permanently, no matter who sat in it. In its place, he proposed a commission, a ruling council made up of the heads of the reorganized New York families, expanded within the following months to include bosses from other cities as well, with no single man standing above the rest. The 5 families Maranzano had drawn up 8 months earlier stayed in place. The chain of command he had formalized, underboss, consigliere, capo, soldier, stayed in place too, and would still be in use, largely unchanged, when federal prosecutors mapped these same families onto an organizational chart more than 50 years later. The throne Maranzano had built for himself, though, did not survive him. Modern historians have revised at least one popular element of this story. For decades, accounts of Maranzano's death were paired with a claim that as many as 40 to 90 old-line Sicilian bosses were killed across the country on the same day, in a coordinated nationwide purge sometimes called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Later research, cross-checking contemporary death records city by city, has found little support for a purge on that scale. Most historians now treat it as a story that grew in the retelling, a handful of documented killings, inflated over decades into a myth. And Raab's 5 families treats the smaller verifiable body count as the historically responsible account, while noting that the myth itself became part of how later generations, including filmmakers, understood this period. Not every detail in this reconstruction is undisputed. Historians differ on the exact date the war began, on how many men attended Maranzano's reorganization meeting, and on precisely who fired the shots that killed each boss. Across every credible historian who has examined the federal files and the court record is the outcome: 5 families, a governing commission, and the end of the one-man-at-the-top model that had defined New York's underworld until this war. It bears stating plainly that the men in this story, and the criminal structure their war produced, represent a small and specific criminal element within Italian-American history, not a reflection of the broader Italian-American community. The overwhelming majority of Italian immigrants who arrived in this same period, from the same regions, built ordinary working lives, ordinary families, and ordinary futures with no connection to any of this. The men named in this episode chose organized crime. Millions of their countrymen did not. 14 months. 2 self-declared supreme bosses, a founding elder statesman, and dozens of soldiers whose names did not survive the historical record. Neither Masseria nor Maranzano lived to see the peace he thought he had won. What outlasted both of them, and outlasted Morello, and outlasted every soldier who died carrying out their orders, was the structure Maranzano built, and Luciano refused to rule alone. 5 families, a governing commission, and a chain of command, designed specifically so that no single man could ever again be worth killing for the way these 2 men had been. That structure, with modifications, governed New York's underworld for the rest of the 20th century, and its outline is still the one federal prosecutors use to describe organized crime in this city today. Organized crime built its empire in the dark. Federal prosecutors and historians spent decades dragging it into the light. The 5 family files exists to document what they found, not to glorify it, not to bury it, but to remember it. Good night from the archive.